to another episode of Analyzing the Apocalypse. Today our topic of conversation is going to be the city of Philadelphia, specifically the letter that Jesus wrote to them concerning the things that were taking place in that congregation and in that city. So what we see follows the same format we've been talking about for all of the 7 churches. And of course, we're at the 6th church of 7, so we have just one more after this. And this one stands out for a very good reason, unlike some of the others, in that this is a congregation that received no condemnation from Jesus. So he's going to commend them thoroughly for their faithfulness, for their perseverance, for what they were doing, and doesn't make many comments about the negative things that were taking place that were internal to the congregation, because it just doesn't seem they had that many issues internally. Their issues came from opposition from the outside of the church. But in Philadelphia, in this particular place, this was a fairly new city in Asia Minor, and by new we mean maybe 200 years old by the time of Revelation being written. And Philadelphia, of course, refers to the city of brotherly love. There's some history behind that regarding 2 Greek brothers that refused to give up on each other and remain loyal, despite opposition from the Roman Empire coming in to take control of their land. But all that being said, and having put that aside, we don't know much about Philadelphia as a congregation. We don't know much about what they did in the first century. We don't know who established the congregation here, who visited there. Those details are lost to history. But again, the focus is less on the history of it and more on the fact that there's no real issues going on with them internally, except for the opposition, of course, they were facing from outside. So really what the Philadelphians are going to need, much like what the Smyrnians needed back in chapter 2, is going to be comfort and assurance. And that's precisely what Jesus provides to his people in the city of Philadelphia. I'll make a quick comment just because I think it's important to recognize that as we've gone through all the 7 churches, including this one that we're going to talk about today, we see Jesus giving to these congregations exactly what they need. And it drives home that point that we talk about with Jesus, where he knows our needs and is aware of what's going on and provides for us what is necessary. We may not like it all the time. We may not always appreciate it, but nevertheless, he provides for his people. And I think in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, we're seeing that come to light in a unique way. But nevertheless, how does Jesus comfort his people? How does he provide them assurance in the city of Philadelphia? Let's go ahead and just read the letter that Jesus had written to them from John. And let's look at Revelation chapter 3, starting with verse 7, and let's just read to verse 13 together. And starting in verse 7, we read this. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it. For you have a little strength, have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Indeed, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world, to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write on him my new name. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So we already have seen this format time and again. Of course, like we've already mentioned, what is absent is the condemnation aspect of the letter, but that's because there was no condemnation to be had for the brethren here in Philadelphia. But this does have some unique characteristics compared to the other letters, even setting aside the reality there was no condemnation here. And one of the unique things is how Jesus introduces himself. Now, we've seen repeatedly in verses like this where there's been some uniqueness that pertains to the situation that the brethren were facing, and this is really not that much different. So notice in verse 7 here, we have Jesus saying that he is the Holy One, he is the True One, and he is the one who has the key of David. So let's go back to our slideshow really quick and talk in further detail about this introduction and what comfort this would have been to the brethren and what Jesus is trying to tell them about himself. So obviously we know that Jesus is holy. That means that he is set apart. He has a special purpose in the framework of creation and all these different ideas that we can come up with. But it's more significant here when you combine that with truth and also the fact that he holds the key of David, because you're describing someone who is trustworthy, who will keep his promises no matter what opposition may be faced. And as we read in that letter, the Philadelphians were facing opposition that was quite significant. And the idea might have seemed that opportunities were dissolving, that there were no open doors anymore, where Jesus is saying the opposite here, where actually no, I'm going to fulfill my promise to you. You're not going to have problems like that. I'm going to bring those things to a conclusion. So Jesus is reaffirming his trustworthiness and trying to tell the Philadelphians to not lose sight of that. The idea of this key of David in verse 7, if you'll notice that's in italics in most translations, it should be in yours. And that means this is a quotation from another place, at least when it's a long form like this. And in this case, it's going to come from Isaiah chapter 22. And the specific section is going to be verses 15 through 25, so the tail end of Isaiah chapter 22, where there's this issue with a certain scribe by the name of Shebna, and it is said that he is going to lose his position and his royal authority, and someone named Eliakim is going to be granted that authority by God's decree. And the idea of the key of David is this royal authority and responsibility that's bestowed upon somebody. So you can imagine that in the ancient world, when you have city walls that are quite high and they have gates that are quite large, those keys are also going to be quite large as well. But they become a symbol of authority, a symbol of who can open the way to something, or vice versa, close the way and keep it locked up. You see the same type of idea with the apostles in the Gospel of Matthew about chapter 16, talking there to Peter, and later in chapter 18 to all of the apostles, the idea of keys to the kingdom. And we still use that phrase today as an idiom in our English language. When we talk about the keys to the kingdom, you're talking about access, you're talking about authority, and that's exactly what's in view here as well. So Jesus is quoting from Isaiah, showing that passage had more significance than just talking about a political issue in the 8th century BC. That's what it had to do with to begin with, but it seems that it had more significance talking about Jesus himself later down the road as one being the only one with authority to open or close his kingdom, and the only one who has the authority to grant access to his kingdom or kick people out of his kingdom. So we look at Jesus that way, we understand he is the one that has the authority to do that. Well, what difference would it have made to the Philadelphians to have that information? Wouldn't they have already known that? Well, sure, they might have known that. But the idea seems to have been, especially with the persecution they were facing, is social isolation. Especially when we talk about what was happening in the synagogue there in Philadelphia, or the synagogues possibly, depending on how many were located in this place. Maybe they were, in effect, disfellowshipped from the synagogue, and the local Jewish population had kicked them out after a few years of them being there. We know that happened in the book of Acts a few different times, so it wouldn't surprise us to know that that took place in Philadelphia. We don't know that with certainty, but that's a possibility here that may explain why Jesus is saying, although some have denied you and kicked you out and made you feel like you're not really in with them, the opposite is true. Because Jesus is saying, here, I have the authority to open my kingdom or close it, and I have declared that you are part of it, and you have fellowship with me as a result, despite what other people might have said who were of the synagogue of Satan that we're going to talk about in just a moment. So in verse 8 then, it's talking more about this royal authority and this idea of a key. So Jesus says that he knows their works, and he has set before them an open door that no one can shut. So again, the idea seems here to either be talking about an opportunity that he's giving to them, or maybe more broadly and more significantly, talking about fellowship with God. Because there's really not too many references here to an evangelistic idea. The letters to the 7 churches don't really have that built into them. There's some references you could talk about, but here it doesn't seem like that's in view. It seems like he's talking more about fellowship with God. And Jesus is saying here, that door is wide open for you. It's not as though that door has been shut. That fellowship has not been cut off, despite what you've been facing and maybe what they had been told. They needed that reminder. That would have been a source of great comfort and encouragement to them to know that despite what they had been hearing and facing, that God was still with them and they still had fellowship with him. And the fact that no one could turn that away from them. That was not an act of man that was possible, but rather an act of God, and he had not turned his back on them. Notice the other detail in verse 8 that's important too. He says that you have little strength, or have a little strength. You've kept my word and have not denied my name. So this tells us a lot about the Philadelphians as Christians, serving Jesus. It says they don't have a lot of strength, but despite that lack of strength, they have kept Jesus' word faithfully, and they have not denied his name. They have not given up their faith in him. And this really is an example to us even to this day. To know that strength does not necessarily mean the only thing that matters in our lives. There might be times that we don't have a lot of strength. And if you think about this at the congregational level, that makes even more sense, where there might be times that there's little strength. And yet Jesus is still able to help us and to give us strength to overcome the obstacles that we face, despite what may be going on. Now, as far as what little strength may mean, in this case, it may be referring to spiritual vigor. It could be referring to numbers in terms of the amount of people who are actually part of the Philadelphian church. All those things are possibilities, but we don't know with certainty. But we do know that there is an obvious idea here of, despite their little strength, they had a strong faith. And that's something that we can really learn from and take as an example. But let's talk more about verse 9 in greater detail to understand the situation they were facing. And I'll draw your attention once again to Smyrna because the parallels are very evident here. They face very similar problems, and we also notice that Philadelphia and Smyrna once more are not condemned by Jesus, but rather are just commended. So to that point in verse 9, there's that reference again to the synagogue of Satan, and here the added detail is they say they are Jews and are not, but lie. And it seems that he really is talking about people who are clinging to Judaism. They're clinging to the law of Moses. They're holding on to that and not letting it go to the point that they would be willing to persecute those that disagree with them. And once again, the book of Acts is filled with that type of information. You see that happen in so many places where there are Jewish people in the synagogues who hear the message of Jesus, and some of them accept it, others are skeptical, and then some outright deny it, and they become very hostile and persecuting the church. Paul himself, though he was an apostle later in life, you recall he started out as a persecutor, and he could have been part of the synagogue of Satan, not because that has anything to do with ethnicity, like I said the last time we had this conversation, but it's more about the attitude and the actions that's in view here. That anybody who aligns themselves against Christ and against his people, they become part of the synagogue of Satan in effect, simply because they have chosen to oppose Jesus and fight against him instead of considering his message and doing something positive with it. So the other thing in verse 9 that's different, though, from what we saw with Smyrna, is the fact that Jesus says here, I'm going to make these false Jews, these false people who claim to be something that they are not, I'm going to make them come and worship before your feet and to know that I have loved you. This could be a reference to a couple different things. It could be the idea of them being humiliated in some public way and the church being exalted in some way, or more likely, and I think more importantly, it's a reference to some of these persecutors actually becoming Christians themselves. So the idea would be that although they're opposing them now and fighting them now, that there's going to be a time that their hearts change. And this is not saying that Jesus is going to force that upon them and take their choice away. That's not at all the case. He's just simply commenting on the fact that there's going to come a time that they are going to maybe view things a little bit differently and come to a faith that is different than what they have at that particular moment. So there's hope built into this, embedded into this message, and a message of comfort too. And not only that, but in verse 10, we have this idea that because they have kept the command to persevere and they have not given up on Jesus despite opposition, Jesus says he's going to spare them from further trial. Now, this is not a permanent solution. This is not a permanent preservation from trial, but he's saying that in this point in time, I'm going to keep you from the trial that's about to come upon the whole world. So seemingly talking there about some of what's going to be discussed in the book of Revelation, looking forward just a little bit to the rest of the content of this book. But he's saying, I'm going to keep you from that. I'm going to preserve you from that so you don't have to deal with it because you've already dealt with enough, and I'm going to preserve you so you don't have to face that difficulty any further. I'll mention this in passing since it's another Old Testament allusion. In Daniel chapter 12, the hour of trial is also talked about quite often. And the hour of trial is meant to be an ambiguous amount of time, but it's meant to be a short period of time of very intense persecution or very intense trial in some respect that really puts people to the test and really challenges their faith. That seems to be what's in view here, and Jesus is saying to the Philadelphians, you're not going to have to deal with that at this point in time. And then verse 11, there's the admonition there and the reminder that Jesus is coming quickly. And we've seen this before with the other letters. This could be a reference to him coming in judgment, or in this case, he's coming to carry out his promises quickly that he's already mentioned. And he's telling them here to hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. So he's telling them, don't allow anybody to interfere with your race to heaven, with your efforts to be the people that I command you to be. Once again, we saw the same thing with Smyrna that we saw in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, that the one that is faithful even to the point of death, what will he receive? The crown of life. And that seems to be basically the same reference here in verse 11. But those are not the only promises that Jesus makes. So he's promising here that opposition is going to kind of end a little bit or maybe come to a conclusion, and they're also going to be preserved from that hour of trial. But he has some other promises he makes too in verses 12 through 13. So once again, you have that language of he who overcomes, this is what I'm going to do for that person. And there's two distinct ideas presented here, two distinct promises that tie into each other but have significance on their own. So Jesus says in verse 12 that the one who overcomes will become a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. Now, just ponder with me what a pillar represents, if you're thinking of it as an image. Now, in the ancient world, as you can see in the image of our background here for our slideshow, there's pillars. So that's part of the reason why they might have recognized this very quickly. But imagine 2,000 years later, this picture was taken probably in the mid-2010s, so it's a little bit older, but you can imagine it's not changed that much. Those pillars are still standing, though, is my point. So a pillar becomes a representation of stability and of strength. Because what is a pillar meant to do but to uphold a structure, to keep it intact, to keep it from falling down upon itself? And that's what's kind of in view here too, but with an added benefit or bonus, in this case, of being a pillar not just in some random area, but a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. This is describing a couple different things that are interrelated. It's describing people who are going to be blessed by Jesus to be near to God, and that nearness is not going to go away. It's not going to be unstable. It's not going to be coming and going. It's going to be persistent. So like a pillar that upholds a temple or upholds a building, these Christians are going to always be close to God if they overcome, if they hold fast to their faith, if they continue in the will of Jesus. He says that you will be a pillar in the house of God, that you'll have closeness to him, that you'll have stability in that closeness, and no one can take that away from you. And once again, returning to what we talked about already with the key of David and the open door that no one could shut, the fact that these people had fellowship with God that no one could take away from them, no matter what they might have said, you can envision why this would have had a tremendous impact on their faith and their comfort in what Jesus was saying. And the second promise he makes here, tied into the first, is the idea of a name being written on these people. Now, we're going to see this come up again in Revelation, but what is this imagery talking about? Why does this matter to have a new name written on yourself? I mean, are we talking about a tattoo here or something like that? Not necessarily. We're talking about something that's more symbolic, because if you're given a new name, there's an indication there that someone has authority over you. And that's not always a bad thing, because in this particular case, you're talking about ownership and identity, and Jesus is saying that he is going to take ownership of his people, and he's going to change their identities in a positive way, and he's going to show they have association with him. So again, the idea of the pillar was about closeness and stability with God, and you see with the new name a very similar idea regarding ownership and identity in Jesus, and the fact that you have closeness with him. So those who overcome basically are promised that they have fellowship with God, that they have an identity that is bound in him and is not bound to what this world might say or what people might do regarding them. It's something that is divine, something that is spiritual, that cannot be taken away. And so despite the opposition the Philadelphians faced, despite the synagogue of Satan that cast them out and viewed them with negativity, that really didn't matter, because what mattered was that if they overcame, they would have identity with Christ, they would have stability with God. That is really, at the end of the day, what made all the difference. And really, it's not different today either. That if we have our identity in Jesus and we cling to that and we lay hold of that, that's what matters. If we look forward to that stability that we have with God and we understand that we can be firm in his service and we can be close to him in that service, how significant that is. So even now, although we are not facing the same situation the Philadelphians were, we still benefit from these promises. And we still remember that it's promised to those who overcome. And like we've been talking about, it's not just to anybody. It's to those who overcome, those who have difficulties, who have an obstacle in front of them, and they choose to be victorious over it through their faith in Jesus Christ, who enables them to overcome those things. And so, to bring things together in verse 13, what do we see as we've seen with all these letters? He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. In other words, take this message to heart. Pay attention to it. Don't let it pass you by. Don't be unaware of its significance. So the Philadelphians are a great example to us to this day. What they were promised is still of great significance to us today. We can learn from them. We can understand that although we face trials and problems, and although people might press in on us and say all manner of evil against us, we don't have to let that discourage us. We might have little strength. We may not, in our own estimation, have a lot to our account, but we can have this, that we hold fast to the word of Jesus, we keep his command to persevere, and we lay hold of those promises that he gives to us. And we can hope and pray that we have the same reputation before Jesus the Philadelphians did, and labor to that point, so that way with the same testimony they have can be ours as well. That's all we have to say for right now regarding this particular church and Revelation. We'll pick up in our next conversation about the Laodiceans and wrapping up our conversation about the seven churches, in fact. And we'll have a good conversation about the Laodiceans, I suspect. Maybe some things that we've not thought about before, but also some important warnings that I think speak to our modern times even more so than some of the other churches that we've talked about up to this point. So as always, I thank you for your time and attention. I hope this has been enlightening to you and helpful for understanding, and we'll talk again soon.